We're speaking today with Miren Gutierrez, who is a doctor in communication and the director of the postgraduate program Data Analysis, Research and Communication at the University of Deusto. She's a member of the research team communication at the university and a very valuable member of our group that has been recognized by the Basque government officially as a research group. She's also an associate researcher at the Overseas Development Institute in London and Data Active at the University of Amsterdam. The focus of her research is on data activism and how people and organizations use the data infrastructure in combination with other technologies for social change. Previously, Miren has been the executive director of Greenpeace in Spain, editorial director of Interpress Service News Agency, correspondent of El País in New York, business editor at La Prensa in Panama, and Southeast Asia correspondent of EFE, Spanish news agency. Miren is here today to speak about her new book, Data Activism and Social Change, published this year, 2018, by Palgrave Macmillan, which already has had a very successful launching because it has been recognized as one of the best 10 books in the world in the field of data activism. So congratulations, Miren, and maybe we would like to start speaking about your book. Since your book's title speaks of data and social change, what is the connection of your work with big data and society studies?
Well, I think that this book, Data Activism and Social Change, sits at the very center of the debates around big data and society. And it talks about a new phenomenon, data activism, which sits at the intersection of technology on the one hand and participation and communication practices on the other hand. And it deals with data at two levels. One is the big data as tools, which are great enablers. They have the capacity to empower people, to empower researchers, to empower activists, but also to hinder and constrain them, and is an object of the study as well. It sits at controversies about power relations between actors such as private actors and privacy actors, and also sits at another controversy on governance issues at all levels. So it's a very interesting object of a study as well.
Mm-hmm. In previous talks and interviews, you have said that the private sector has monopolized the mainstream narratives about big data. How is your book an alternative perspective on this topic, on big data?
Well, it talks about bottom-up practices. It talks about how people, ordinary people, and organizations, non-governmental organizations, employ the data infrastructure. And it also responds in a way to Kennedy, Poyles, and Van Dijk's invitation to ground big data studies and big data research on real life, real world practices, experiences. So instead of talking from a private sector perspective, talks about how people, real people employ the data infrastructure.
I believe that your book is very easy to read precisely because you provide so many examples about practical issues such as collaboration, maps, solutions, actions, but at the same time it is very complex and it is very well researched. Can you tell us what are the theoretical roots of the text?
Well, the problem is that data activism is a fairly new phenomenon, and there's no discipline dedicated to it. So I had to resort to a wide array of disciplines. But the main perspectives that I have employed include critical data studies, including Tufekci, Brahman, Milan, Gittelman, and many other authors, and also media, communication, and social movement studies, including a variety of authors as well there, including Della Porta, Melucci, Castells, Habermas, and many others.
Mm-hmm. Since your book talks about data and is centered on the topic, where did you get the data for this study?
Well, I get it mainly from three sources: empirical observation of dozens of cases. I also did lots of, dozens of semi-structured interviews with data practitioners, and there is a main case study that I use to illustrate data activism in action.
Mm-hmm. Part of your methodological approach included interviews. Who did you interview, and what was your criteria for choosing the people that you were interviewing?
Well, the thing is that nobody knows how big the universe of data activists is. So, well, it's not a statistically representative sample. But I try to be as inclusive as possible. And sometimes the problem is that data activists do not present themselves, introduce themselves as data activists. In fact, some people in the interviews tell me, hey, well, I've been a data activist all my life and I didn't realize that. So it's been difficult to pinpoint and to select the interviewees. But they include people like an epidemiologist that uses the data infrastructure and crowdsources data as a way of empowering people in the face of epidemics, and conventional activists that are discovering the power of the data infrastructure to analyze data and also convey stories, to communicate stories behind the data, and also generate evidence to support their cases. It includes data journalists, for example, that have been forced to cross the lines dividing journalism and activism because of the lack of openness and transparency and open data. And also platform builders that are collaborating with campaigning organizations to come up with instruments and tools that can facilitate the analysis, the data analysis, and the also communication of the data. So all sorts of people from different sectors.
Mm-hmm. We know that the book has been very successful, and it is a book that involves a lot of work, and you spent a long time writing the book. But what was the original idea? Why did you think at the beginning that this was something that needed to be researched?
Well, it draws from different sources. First of all, I've been a researcher with the Overseas Development Institute. It's an organization that deals with development issues, and I've been researching on issues such as illegal fishing and doing database research and big database research on illegal fishing. And in 2014, I was working on a project on illegal fishing, and my colleagues and I started to put together the rudiments of what I understood should be a data project, which included very strong alliances, robust data sets, a strong media-rich plan, lobbying, etc. And 2 years later, we published an interactive map that showed foreign vessels involved in irregular operations in Africa. And it was very successful because it was very impactful. Immediately, within days, 150 plus media outlets had covered the issue, the findings, including the BBC, CNN, The Guardian, El País. And the Gambia, for example, decided to ban all operations in its waters. Namibia signed an agreement, an FAO's agreement to deter illegal fishing. So there was it had a lot of impact. Also, the methodology was employed by other organizations. Focus on how fish is being transferred from one vessel to another at sea, where nobody can see what's going on. So that perspective was employed by other organizations. And I think that it shifts the inaction on on illegal fishing at the time. It was very, very powerful. And that made me think about the possibilities, the possibility of data activism. So at the same time, in 2014, I was also invited by Stefania Milan to lecture on data journalism at the University of Utrecht. And we came up with the term, data activism, to refer to activism that is enabled and constrained, as I said at the beginning, by the data infrastructure. So we started to theorize about it and came up with an article that we published in 2015 called Citizens Media Meets Big Data, in which we compare data activism with citizens media and outline the main questions around this new phenomenon. And those early ruminations are the beginnings of this book.
Mm-hmm. One of the richness of the book and one of the major contributions is that in it you offer a kind of paradigm that is going to be useful for future readers and researchers interested in data activism and social change. So what sort of classifications does the book present?
Well, the first classification that I come up with is based on the dozens of interviews and cases that I have reviewed, and divides data activists into four clusters. The first cluster includes skills transfers. The second, catalysts. I have called them catalysts, and the third includes data journalism producers, and the fourth is the data activists proper. The first one includes organizations that are dedicated to bridging the gaps between unskilled and the skill holders and the unskilled. And they usually sort of create opportunities for collaboration. They build platforms and tools that facilitate this bridging of between unskilled and skilled. And they also deploy experts, for example, data scientists, to work with campaigning organizations. So in that exchange, also skills are transferred from one place to the other. The second group, the catalysts, are specialized in funding and providing the resources for these projects. The third, data journalism producers, are a very special group because they are activists that have seen a gap in data journalism and decide to generate data journalism because there is a vacuum there. And also journalism deserves a lot of space in the book because journalism has been a pioneer in visualizing data, so has created lots of tools and ways of communicating complexity that have been very, very innovative. And also, journalism is also an entry point for some data activists, So that's why there's a lot of attention devoted to that group.
Okay, you have explained some of the classifications, but what other taxonomies do you include in your book?
Well, for example, in the illegal fishing project, I realized that obtaining data could be a lens that could serve to classify these different data activists. It was for the project. It was extremely difficult to create the database. We were working with Fish Spectrum, our partners, and they had dedicated lots of years to put together the biggest database on fishing vessels in the world. But it was very, very difficult. Although most of these data are in public registries, they are scattered around a myriad of registries. They are not standardized. They don't talk to each other. And also some of the data are hidden behind layers of red tape, secret agreements. So all these data might be public, but they are not open at all. So that made me think that the lens that I could employ to create more taxonomies could be the way data activists obtain data. So I came up with 5 ways in which data activists obtain data. from the easiest way to the most complex, which is not that doesn't mean that analyzing the data is easier at all. But you could get the data just because a whistleblower gave them to you. So that's the easiest way to get data. You can also resort to public data, as we did, or hopefully, or if it's open data, it's easier to use. But if data are not available, the activists are very, very creative in obtaining data. For example, some of them have created crowdsourcing platforms to harvest citizen data. For example, my case study, Usahidi does that. You can also appropriate the data, and there an array of technology that allow that. For example, scrapping data from websites. And finally, you can also generate the data from scratch from primary research that can be datafiable, or via sensors and drones, which is a growing space within data activism, especially to create maps, which is a favorite visualization tool for data activists.
I believe that we are getting a very good idea of some of the major contributions of your book. Would you mention any other contributions that you have not explained yet?
Well, I also came up with 11 attributes that data activists exhibit. The three most common attributes are that data activists tend to work in alliances. They are proactive, and they generate a lot of buy-in, and they prefer, they are inclined to generate alliances or joint teams or whatever. That's probably because big data sets are too big for just one organization to handle. You need more skills than just dealing with conventional activism, for example, sometimes. And also the issues that these activists deal with, for example, climate change, are too big for one organization to deal with. So they are inclined to generate these alliances. They are also unapologetic hybrids. They just don't care whether they are researching, doing journalism, doing advocacy. They're not very worried about crossing lines, using different repertoires of action and tools. And the objective is to have impact and to generate solutions on action. So an example of that is Vagabundos de la Chatarra. Yeah, it's a book, a comics journalism book. It means scrap drifters. And it's about, it mixes comics journalism, interactive maps, all sorts of videos and all sorts of resources to tell the stories about people who survived the crisis in Barcelona, the economic crisis, by collecting metal scraps and selling them for a living. And another characteristic or attribute that could be attached to data activists is that they like maps a lot. They prefer maps. They're inclined to use critical cartography to generate alternative stories, to generate bottom-up stories, to gather and visualize the citizen data, etc. So the maps are a favorite tool for data activists.
Great. I think we are learning a lot about these hybrid methods used in data activism. You chose a central case study for your book, and you develop it in profundity, quite profoundly. Will you tell us about this central case study in your book, please?
Well, I've chosen the Usahidi platform. It means testimony in Swahili. It was an organization created and set up in 2008 in the violence, post-electoral violence in Kenya. And the intention was to visualize the stories of victims and relatives that weren't being told by the government or the conventional media. So 2 years later, in 2010, the platform was launched to visualize victims and stories, their stories during the earthquake in Haiti. And that was a turning point for humanitarianism, because in a matter of hours, they were able to visualize, well, they were able to verify and visualize hundreds of reports or, you know, requests for assistance and that sort of thing. And it was something that hadn't been done before. So it was a turning point in humanitarianism, because it was the beginning of digital humanitarianism. Mm-hmm. I've used the Usahidi platform as a case that illustrates data activism in action. I have used all these taxonomies and, you know, notions that I have come up with in this journey that I have done to examine this platform in depth, to conclude that it's a geo-activist organization, so a data activist organization that employs maps and as a way of, you know, analyzing data and communicating it and transforming it into actionable information. That is, that the preferred way in which they gather data is crowdsourcing citizen data. They also use some scrapping to verify the data. And that is a full-blown, for me, a full-blown data activist endeavor.
Mm-hmm. And what does the study reveal about Usahidi?
Well, I would say two things. One is that there are asymmetries in the way these the actors that convey around the map there are asymmetries found in the way they communicate and work together. In spite of being very horizontal and very inclusive and very participative, the platform creates asymmetries in the actors that convey around the map. One group of actors are the digital humanitarians. They are the deployers of the platform. They are working remotely and they're not working most of the time on the ground. Then you have the reporters who include the citizens that are reporting the data from the ground. This includes so-called victims and witnesses and relatives. And then you have a third group, which include the conventional humanitarians that are working on the ground to assist victims, etc. So the deployers of the map are working mostly in remote locations, which is not the same as facing a disaster in situ. So it's quite different. Another asymmetry is that the deployers of the map become sort of gatekeepers of what data is acceptable, how to classify the information that emerges from the data. So they're not equal, but it's an inclusive activity, but they're not equal. And the other thing is that this digital humanitarianism has been extremely disruptive for conventional humanitarianism. It has questioned the way things were done, the way crises and disasters were tackled before. It has questioned also by the fact that they include citizens in the data generation and also in the decision-making process. It's been really disruptive. The way they generate different alternative narratives around a disaster is also disruptive. So it has been, as I said at the beginning, a turning point in humanitarianism as well.
Very good. So to conclude this interview, I would like to ask you about any final thoughts, either in the book or about your future work or perspectives that you see in data activism and social change.
Well, I think that The book is it's a contribution to theory around big data and society, but also I think one of the biggest contributions is telling stories that are real from the real world, and that you know, in the current situation where most of the big data narratives are being monopolized by the private sector, there are authors that say that a sort of magical thinking surrounds artificial intelligence that is thought as a recipe for all, a cure-all, a panacea that is going to solve all our problems. And you know, code is discussed in almost biblical terms, some authors say, because you know, companies such as Google, Amazon, Facebook are selling and defending their algorithms as neutral. And we know that's not true. We know that's not true at all. So I think that this book, you know, visualizes and illustrates how people are coming up with down-to-earth stories about big data and data, and that's possibly the biggest contribution of the book.
Thank you very much for this interview. Thank you.
Thank you.